Allow me to introduce myself. Commander Flax Vortenberg, third-class strategic theorist of the Zentorian Republic, graduate summa cum laude from the Galactic Peace Academy. You know, back when it actually meant something to graduate from there, before they started letting in just anyone from backwater planets with cute little primitive civilizations. The Galactic Peace Academy sits on Harmony 7, a planet so aggressively peaceful that the flowers apologize when you pick them. The architecture is all flowing curves and soothing pastels, designed by committee to offend absolutely no one. Even the cafeteria serves conflict-free cuisine, which tastes exactly as bland as it sounds. Our mission, as stated in the 47-page charter written in the most diplomatic language possible, is to teach civilized warfare. That's right, civilized warfare. The art of conducting military operations with proper etiquette, advance notice, and at least 3 formal warnings before anyone gets their feelings hurt. We're talking about warfare with timeouts, mandatory lunch breaks, and a complaint department. The student body represents the finest military minds from across the galaxy. Well, the most polite military minds anyway. We have crystalline beings who think in geometric patterns, energy creatures who communicate through interpretive light shows, and amphibious folks who insist on having all their strategy meetings in hot tubs. Then the human arrived. Lieutenant Jake Morrison stepped off the transport shuttle looking like someone's harmless cousin who fixes computers for a living. Average height, brown hair, unremarkable face, and the kind of easy smile that makes you think he probably helped old ladies cross streets in his spare time. He carried one small duffel bag and a tablet computer that looked like it was held together with hopes and prayers. "Hey there," he said, waving at our reception committee like we were old friends at a barbecue. "Thanks for having me. This place looks amazing. Very peaceful." Professor Quinn Mellebark, our head of student affairs, rustled his leaves in what passed for Sylvani laughter. "Welcome, young human. We're so excited to have a representative from your charming little planet. We understand Earth has recently achieved interstellar travel. How delightfully primitive." Jake's smile never wavered. "Yeah, we're pretty new to all this. Still figuring things out, you know? Learning as we go." The other cadets snickered. Pip Glosswing, an insectoid from the Hive Collective, clicked his mandibles in what I assumed was amusement. Nova Starbright, who existed as a vaguely humanoid collection of swirling energy, pulsed with condescending colors. Even Thum Rockjaw, normally the gentlest soul in the academy despite being literally made of living stone, rumbled with quiet mirth. Poor little human. They had no idea what they were in for. As the academy's senior tactical instructor, I'd reviewed his file. Earth had apparently never engaged in any major interstellar conflicts, had no formal military alliances with galactic powers, and their application essay was mostly about promoting peace through understanding. Adorable, really. "Don't worry," I told him as we walked toward the dormitories. "We'll teach you everything you need to know about proper military conduct. By the time you graduate, you'll understand how civilized species handle disagreements." Jake nodded enthusiastically. "That sounds great. I'm really looking forward to learning how you guys do things out here. Should be interesting to compare notes." Compare notes. As if their species had anything to contribute to military science beyond enthusiasm and good intentions. Jake's first class was Introduction to Polite Conquest with Professor Mellebark, a course required for all incoming students. I decided to observe, partly out of professional interest and partly because watching new students grapple with galactic military protocols was always entertaining. Professor Mellebark had arranged his classroom with the usual care for diplomatic seating. No species was positioned in a way that might suggest dominance over another. The lighting was adjusted for optimal comfort across 17 different visual spectrums. Even the air was filtered to accommodate everyone's breathing requirements, though it always ended up smelling faintly of vanilla and regret. "Welcome, students, to your introduction to civilized warfare," Professor Mellebark announced, his bark gleaming with fresh polish. "Today we'll be covering the fundamental principles that separate us from barbaric species who still engage in crude, unregulated violence." The other students took dutiful notes. Jake raised his hand. "Yes, Lieutenant Morrison? Quick question about the reading assignment. The Galactic Convention on Ethical Warfare. It says here that you have to give 72 hours notice before beginning hostilities? Correct. Proper etiquette demands advance warning so all parties can prepare appropriately. Jake looked genuinely puzzled. But what if you just didn't tell them? Like what if you just showed up and started fighting? The classroom went dead silent. Professor Mellabark's leaves began to tremble, which in Sylvani body language indicated either confusion or the early stages of photosynthetic shock. I don't understand the question, Lieutenant Morrison. I mean, wouldn't that give you a pretty big advantage? They wouldn't be ready or anything. Pip Glosswing dropped his stylus. Nova Starbright's colors shifted to a disturbed shade of ultraviolet. Thum Rockjaw's granite features somehow managed to convey bewilderment. But that would be unsporting, Professor Mellabark managed. Sure, but you'd win faster. Probably with fewer casualties too, since the fighting wouldn't last as long. Professor Mellabark began flipping frantically through his lecture notes, clearly searching for the section on dealing with sociopathic students. Finding nothing, he moved on to safer ground. Let's discuss surrender protocols, he said, his voice only slightly shaky. When an opponent wishes to yield, they must file Form 27B in triplicate, submit it through proper channels, and wait for acknowledgement before hostilities can cease. Jake raised his hand again. Several students visibly flinched. What happens if they don't have the right forms? Well, then they must continue fighting until proper paperwork can be obtained. They have to keep fighting because of paperwork? Correct. Otherwise, how would we maintain proper records? Jake stared at Professor Mellabark for a long moment. Has anyone ever mentioned that this system might be a little weird? Professor Mellabark's bark began making creaking sounds that I'd never heard before. The other students were exchanging worried glances. Even I was starting to feel slightly uncomfortable, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. Perhaps we should move on to theoretical scenarios, Professor Mellabark said quickly. Let's discuss the proper way to conduct a siege. First, you must formally request permission to besiege from the local authorities. What if you just surrounded the place and didn't let anyone in or out? The creaking sounds got louder. That would be a violation of the siege courtesy protocols. But it would work, right? Professor Mellabark excused himself to get some water, and possibly sedatives. Jake sat there looking perfectly pleasant, apparently unaware that he'd just suggested war crimes as casually as someone might recommend a good restaurant. The other students began whispering among themselves in their various languages, clicks, and energy frequencies. I caught fragments of the conversations, words like primitive and barbaric, and someone should warn the administration. But as I watched Jake sitting there, still smiling that harmless smile, I started to wonder if maybe we were the ones who were missing something. 2 days later, Jake was assigned to my advanced tactics course. I'd been looking forward to this. After Professor Mellabark's nervous breakdown, it was clear the human needed some proper guidance from someone with actual combat experience. My classroom was designed to intimidate. Dark walls, strategic lighting, and a holographic display system that could simulate any battlefield scenario in the known galaxy. Maps of famous campaigns covered every surface, from the siege of Crystalline City to the Great Politeness War of the Outer Rim. Today we'll be studying siege warfare, I announced as the students filed in. Specifically, how to conduct a proper 3-week siege with appropriate etiquette and maximum educational value for all participants. I activated the holodisplay, showing a fortress on a hill surrounded by convenient siege positions that had obviously been designed by committee to provide equal opportunities for attackers and defenders. As you can see, the fortress is well positioned, but not impregnable. Using traditional methods, a civilized siege would require 3 weeks of polite encirclement, formal challenges, and structured negotiations. Who can tell me the first step? Nova Starbright pulsed eagerly. File a declaration of intent to besiege with the fortress commander? Excellent. And then? Pip Glosswing clicked excitedly. Wait for their response to declaration. acknowledging receipt and requesting clarification of terms? Perfect. Thum? The rock giant rumbled thoughtfully. Begin Phase 1 encirclement, maintaining proper distance to avoid appearing threatening? Outstanding. You see, class, siege warfare is an art form that requires patience, diplomacy, and respect for your opponent's dignity. Jake raised his hand. I should have pretended not to see it. Yes, Lieutenant Morrison? Why don't you just go around? I'm sorry? The fortress. Why don't you just go around it? I mean, what's it guarding? I stared at him. This was advanced tactical theory, not kindergarten geography. It's a fortress. You siege fortresses. That's what they're for. But what if you just ignored it and attacked whatever you actually want? Like if they're protecting a city, why not just go attack the city and let them sit in their fortress? The other students looked confused. I felt a small tick developing under my left eye. Because then they would sally forth from the fortress to engage you. Okay, so you fight them in the open field where you have room to maneuver, instead of trying to assault a fortified position. That seems way easier. I opened my mouth to explain why this was completely wrong, then closed it again. Then opened it. The words wouldn't come. Or Jake continued cheerfully, what if you just set the whole hill on fire? I mean, if it's wood and stone construction, it'll burn eventually. Pip Glosswing made a sound like a tea kettle having a nervous breakdown. Nova Starbright's colors cycled through what I recognized as the spectrum for existential crisis. You can't just set things on fire. I finally managed. Why not? Melee. Because that's not how civilized warfare works. But it would work, right? That was the problem. It would work. It would work terrifyingly well. I found myself staring at the holographic fortress, imagining it surrounded by flames instead of polite siege lines and feeling slightly nauseous. Lieutenant Morrison, I said carefully, perhaps you could share with us how humans typically conduct warfare. Jake's face lit up like I'd just asked him about his favorite hobby. Oh, it's pretty simple, really. You figure out what the enemy wants to protect, then you break it until they give up. The faster you can break their stuff, the quicker the whole thing's over. And what about honor? Tradition. The rules of engagement. Rules are great, but winning's better. I mean, there's no point in fighting a war you're planning to lose, right? Thum Rockjaw, bless his sedimentary soul, tried to be helpful. But what about minimizing casualties and property damage? Oh, totally, Jake nodded. The faster you win, the fewer people get hurt. That's why you hit them as hard as possible right from the start. Get it over with quick. Meant. The classroom had gone very, very quiet. I realized that somewhere in the back of my mind a small voice was whispering that everything I'd been taught about warfare was wrong. And this pleasant human with his easy smile had just explained why. I decided to change the subject before I had to confront that possibility. Let's move on to defensive strategies, I said weakly. Jake raised his hand again. I pretended not to see it, but he started talking anyway. Oh, I've got some great ideas about that too. The Academy's crown jewel was the ultra-realistic combat simulator, a room-sized holographic environment that could recreate any battlefield scenario with perfect fidelity. We'd spent a fortune on it, and it was the envy of military academies across the galaxy. For today's exercise, I'd programmed a standard hostage rescue scenario. Terrorists had taken civilians captive in a fortified compound. The students had to extract the hostages using approved galactic protocols while minimizing casualties and maintaining proper procedure. The simulation typically took 6 hours to complete properly. Most students needed 8. The record was held by a crystalline strategist who'd managed it in 4 hours and 37 minutes, while maintaining perfect diplomatic relations with the hostage takers. Remember, I announced to the assembled students, this exercise tests not just your tactical abilities, but your adherence to civilized standards of conduct. You'll be graded on process as much as results. The other students nodded seriously and began pulling up the appropriate protocol manuals on their tablets. Jake walked up to the control panel and started examining the scenario parameters. "Interesting setup," he said. "So we've got 12 hostages, 8 terrorists, fortified compound with limited entry points. What's our equipment loadout?" "Standard Academy issue," I replied. "Non-lethal restraint weapons, diplomatic communication devices, and a full library of proper procedure forms." "Uh-huh. And what about cutting torches? Explosives? Smoke grenades?" "This is a civilized rescue operation, Lieutenant Morrison, not some barbaric assault." Right. Okay, how about just basic tools? Wire cutters? Crowbars?" I sighed. "The maintenance closet is accessible if you need cleaning supplies." Jake's eyes lit up in a way that, in retrospect, should have been a warning. "Perfect. Give me 5 minutes." He disappeared into the simulation. The rest of us watched on the monitoring screens as his avatar moved through the virtual environment. Instead of approaching the front gate where protocol demanded he announce his presence, Jake went around to the back of the compound. "What is he doing?" Pip Glosswing clicked nervously. On screen, Jake had found the building's electrical junction box. With a few quick movements, he cut the power to the entire compound. "That's not in the manual," Nova Starbright pulsed uncertainly. Next, Jake located the building's ventilation system. Using supplies from the maintenance closet, he began mixing cleaning chemicals together in ways that I was pretty sure violated several galactic safety protocols. Is he making poison gas?" Professor Mellobark asked, his leaves rustling with horror. "Not poison." Jake's voice came through the communication system, sounding annoyingly cheerful. "Just something to make everyone sleepy. Don't worry, it's mostly harmless." The simulation showed Jake pumping his improvised sleeping gas into the ventilation system. Within minutes, everyone in the compound, terrorists and hostages alike, was unconscious. "Now what?" I asked, morbidly curious despite myself. Jake casually walked through the back door, which was no longer locked since the electronic systems were down. He zip-tied the unconscious terrorists, carried the hostages outside to safety, and called for medical assistance. Total elapsed time, 14 minutes. The simulation ended with a cheerful chime and a message: "Exercise complete. All hostages rescued. 0 casualties. Please rate your experience." The classroom was dead silent. "So," Jake said, walking out of the simulator, "how'd I do?" Professor Mellobark fainted. Just toppled over like a tree in a strong wind, his leaves scattered across the floor. "You can't just," I stammered. "Can't just what?" "I saved everyone and nobody got hurt." "Isn't that the point?" "But the protocols, the procedures. You completely ignored every rule of proper hostage negotiation." Jake looked genuinely confused. Why would I negotiate when I could just win? I mean, talking takes time, and the longer those people were in danger, the worse it could have gotten. Pip Glosswing was making that tea kettle sound again. Nova Starbright had turned a color I didn't recognize, probably because it represented emotions that civilized species weren't supposed to have. "Lieutenant Morrison," I said carefully, "when you say this is how humans typically handle these situations." "Oh, sure. I mean, this was pretty basic stuff. Back home, we'd probably use flashbangs and a coordinated breach, but I figured I should keep it simple for a school exercise." The simulation computer, apparently having processed Jake's performance, displayed his scores on the main screen. Perfect marks across the board with a note that he'd set a new academy record. I realized I needed to call an emergency faculty meeting. Immediately. The emergency faculty meeting was held in Professor Mellobark's office, mostly because he refused to leave his chair after regaining consciousness. The other department heads had arrived within minutes of my panicked summons, and they all wore expressions of barely contained horror. "Gentlemen, colleagues, fellow educators," I began, We may have made a slight miscalculation regarding our human exchange student. Dean Whisperleaf, an ancient Sylvani whose bark had turned silver with age, rustled impatiently. Commander Vortenberg, your message mentioned something about tactical innovations that violate the natural order. Please elaborate. I activated the room's holographic display and showed them recordings from Jake's classes. The siege discussion. The hostage rescue. His casual questions about warfare that had left 3 professors requiring therapy. The human appears to approach military problems from a fundamentally different perspective, I explained. One that prioritizes efficiency over procedure, results over protocol. Barbaric, muttered Professor Grimbash, head of diplomatic combat studies. Absolutely barbaric. Perhaps, said Dr. Stellarwind, our Xenot psychology expert, but effective. These results are unprecedented. Dean Whisperleaf's leaves began to shake. Has anyone actually researched human military history? I mean, beyond the basic cultural survey we received with their application? The silence that followed was telling. I took the liberty, I said reluctantly, of conducting a more thorough investigation into Earth's past conflicts. I brought up the files I'd spent the previous night reviewing, files that had left me staring at my ceiling until dawn, questioning everything I thought I knew about warfare. It appears, I continued, that our initial research may have been somewhat incomplete. The holographic display filled with data, battle statistics, casualty figures, tactical analyses, strategic innovations that made my stomach turn. World War II, I read from my notes, involved over 100 million military personnel across 6 continents. Duration, 6 years. Casualties estimated between 70 and 85 million. Professor Mellebark made a sound like wind through dead leaves. The humans developed something called blitzkrieg, which translates roughly to lightning war. The concept involves overwhelming force applied at maximum speed to achieve rapid victory. How rapid? Dr. Stellarwind asked weakly. They conquered most of Europe in less than 2 years. I brought up more files. They also pioneered concepts such as total war, where entire societies are considered legitimate targets. Scorched earth tactics, where retreating forces destroy everything that might be useful to the enemy. And something called mutually assured destruction. What's that last one? Dean Whisperleaf asked, though his tone suggested he didn't really want to know. The humans built weapons capable of destroying their entire planet. Thousands of them. The strategic doctrine was that any attack would result in complete annihilation of both sides. The room fell silent except for the sound of Professor Mellebark's leaves rustling in what I recognized as barely controlled panic. There's more, I said, because apparently I hated myself. Lieutenant Morrison mentioned that he's considered mild-mannered by human standards. I did some research into Earth's current military capabilities. I pulled up the latest files. Modern human military doctrine, current weapons systems, strategic capabilities that made my head hurt just thinking about them. They have weapons that can strike targets anywhere on their planet within 30 minutes, invisible aircraft that can penetrate any defense system, and their current military budget is larger than the gross domestic product of most galactic civilizations. Dr. Stellarwind was frantically taking notes. This explains so much about his psychological profile. He's not a sociopath, he's just human. This is how his entire species thinks about conflict. The question, said Dean Whisperleaf slowly, is what do we do about it? We all looked at each other. We were educators, diplomats, theorists. We'd spent our careers studying the civilized art of warfare, the careful balance of force and restraint that kept the galaxy from descending into chaos. And we'd just discovered that we'd invited a member of a species that had apparently never heard of restraint. The final exam is tomorrow, I said finally. Cancel it, Professor Grimbash suggested quickly. We can't cancel it. The other students are expecting it, and Lieutenant Morrison needs to complete his requirements to graduate. Then we modify it, Dr. Stellarwind said, to make it impossible for him to do whatever it is he does. I thought about Jake's cheerful smile, his innocent questions, his casual suggestions about setting things on fire. "I don't think that's possible," I said. The Academy's final examination was our pride and joy, a massive war game conducted in the holographic training facility, expanded to accommodate battles across multiple star systems. Student teams would be given command of fleets, armies, and entire civilizations in a complex scenario designed to test everything they'd learned about civilized warfare. The exercise typically took 3 days to complete. The scenario involved multiple factions with competing interests, complex diplomatic relationships, and enough rules and regulations to fill a small library. Victory was achieved through careful negotiation, strategic patience, and maintaining the moral high ground. I'd spent weeks designing this year's scenario, 7 different teams representing various galactic powers, each with specific objectives that would require cooperation, compromise, and careful adherence to civilized protocols. Jake had been assigned to Team Terra, along with Pip Glosswing, Thum Rockjaw, and Nova Starbright. I'd deliberately given them the most difficult starting position, hoping that might contain whatever damage the human might cause. The other teams gathered in the main briefing hall, their commanders studying complex strategic manuals and plotting elaborate campaigns. Team Terra met in a corner of the room. "Okay, team," Jake said cheerfully. "So we need to achieve economic dominance over the Centauri sector, while maintaining diplomatic relations with at least 3 allied species and avoiding any violations of the Galactic Peace Accords. Simple enough." Pip Glosswing's mandibles clicked nervously. "Jake, the other teams have been preparing for months. They have detailed strategic plans, diplomatic frameworks, and economic models." "Cool," Jake nodded. "What's our objective again?" Nova Starbright pulsed in confused colors. "To win the war game while demonstrating superior strategic thinking and civilized conduct." "Right, so we just need to win?" Thum Rockjaw rumbled uncertainly. "Well, yes, but within the established parameters of civilized warfare." Jake thought about this for approximately 3.7 seconds. "Okay, here's the plan. We win." "That's not a plan," Pip protested. "That's just winning." "Exactly." The war game began at 0800 hours. The massive holographic display showed star systems, trade routes, military positions, and diplomatic relationships spanning 3 sectors of known space. Each team had been given command of a different faction with carefully balanced strengths and weaknesses. Team Alpha, representing the Crystalline Empire, began by establishing trade negotiations with Team Beta. Team Beta, the Aquatic Federation, responded by proposing a mutual defense pact with Team Gamma. Team Gamma, the Energy Collective, initiated diplomatic contact with Teams Delta, Echo, and Foxtrot to establish a multilateral peace treaty. I monitored their progress from the control room, nodding approvingly. This was exactly how civilized species handled complex strategic situations, carefully, diplomatically, with proper attention to protocol and procedure. Then I checked on Team Terra. Jake had opened communications with all 6 other teams simultaneously. "Hey everyone," his voice came through the communication system. "This is Jake from Team Terra. Just wanted to let you all know that we're going to win this thing. So you might want to surrender now and save everyone some time." The other team's commanders looked confused. This wasn't in any of the strategic manuals. "I'm sorry," came the response from Team Alpha. "Did you just threaten us?" "Not a threat," Jake replied cheerfully. "Just letting you know what's going to happen. You guys can keep doing your trade negotiations and peace treaties and stuff, but we're going to be over here winning. Thought you should know." I watched in fascination as Jake's team began their moves. Instead of following established protocols for economic expansion, they identified the 3 most profitable trade routes in the sector and took them. Not through negotiation or diplomatic pressure, but by simply moving their forces into position and declaring the routes closed to other traffic. "You can't do that," Team Beta protested. "Those are neutral shipping lanes." "We're neutral," Jake corrected. "Now they're ours. You can still use them, but you'll need to pay transit fees." Within 2 hours, Team Terra controlled the economic lifelines of the entire sector. The other teams found their carefully planned trade negotiations irrelevant, their diplomatic overtures meaningless, their strategic positions compromised. "This is highly irregular," Team Gamma complained. "You're violating dozens of established protocols." "Am I breaking any actual rules?" Jake asked. I frantically checked the rule book. Technically, no. The rules assumed that teams would follow civilized conventions, not whatever this was. By noon, Jake had leveraged his control of the trade routes into military advantages. While the other teams were still forming committees to discuss potential alliance structures, Team Terra was capturing key strategic positions. "How is this possible?" Professor Mellowbark whispered from beside me. "He's fighting 6 teams simultaneously and winning." "He's not fighting them," I realized with growing horror. "He's just not playing by their rules." The other teams kept trying to engage Jake in traditional diplomatic negotiations, offering treaties and compromises and carefully structured agreements. Jake listened politely to each proposal, then ignored them completely, and continued advancing his positions. By 1,400 hours, it was over. Jake had achieved total economic dominance over the Centauri sector, maintained diplomatic relations with his allies by the simple expedient of never actually fighting them, but avoided violations of the Galactic Peace Accords by never formally declaring war on anyone. Total elapsed time, 6 hours. The simulation ended with Team Terra controlling 67% of the sector's resources, holding strategic positions throughout the theater, and maintaining technical compliance with all civilized warfare protocols. The other teams sat in stunned silence. "So," Jake said, walking over to where I stood frozen in disbelief, "how'd we do?" Professor Mellowbark fainted again. Dean Whisperleaf made a sound like wind through a graveyard. Dr. Stellarwind was furiously taking notes, probably for the research paper that was going to revolutionize military theory. But Lieutenant Morrison, I managed. That was unprecedented. "Thanks, it was fun." "Kind of simple, but fun." Simple. He'd just dismantled 6 carefully planned military campaigns in 6 hours and called it simple. "Jake," I said carefully, "when you get back to Earth, what are you planning to do with what you've learned here?" His face lit up with that harmless smile that no longer looked harmless at all. "Oh, I'm just an exchange student. Wait until you meet my classmates back at the War College. They're way better at this stuff than I am." The blood drained from my face. "Your classmates?" "Yeah, I'm just studying interplanetary logistics. The guys in the strategic warfare program, or the ones doing their PhDs in applied military theory. They're going to love hearing about all this civilized warfare stuff. They'll probably have some really interesting ideas about how to improve it." I realized that somewhere in the galaxy there was an entire planet full of beings who thought like Jake Morrison, beings who considered him mild-mannered, beings who approached warfare as a problem to be solved rather than an art to be appreciated. Dean Whisperleaf cleared his throat. "Lieutenant Morrison, on behalf of the Galactic Peace Academy, I want to assure you that Earth will always have our friendship in utmost respect." "Aw, thanks. That's really nice of you guys." "In fact," the Dean continued, his voice slightly strained, "I think it's safe to say that the Academy's official position is that Earth should never, under any circumstances, be considered a potential military threat by anyone in the galaxy." "That's sweet, but you don't need to worry about us. We're pretty peaceful, all things considered." I thought about those files I'd read. 80 million casualties. Weapons that could destroy planets. Strategic doctrines based on mutual assured destruction. "Of course you are," I said weakly. "Jake graduated with highest honors. We gave him a medal, a certificate, and a personal recommendation letter that I made sure included the phrase Earth's military capabilities should never be underestimated 17 times. After he left, we held another faculty meeting. The result was a unanimous decision to update the Academy's charter with a new fundamental principle. The Galactic Peace Academy exists to promote civilized warfare among civilized species. Earth is very nice and we should all be friends with them. We also added a new motto, carved in stone above the Academy's main entrance, per aspera ad astra, but not if it involves humans. I've since retired from active teaching and now work as a consultant for the Galactic Defense Council. My job is simple. Whenever someone suggests that maybe Earth isn't such a big deal, I show them Jake Morrison's training videos. No one's been stupid enough to threaten Earth yet. I'd like to keep it that way.